Part 3. The troops from the Great Underground Tomb of Nazarick were divided into two groups and stationed in the swamp. The Zombie Division was on the Lizardmen's left flank, while the Skeleton Division was on their right. The Skeleton Archers and Skeleton Riders were stationed behind the other skeletons. The Beast Zombies were kept in the rear, as though they were a command company. The Lizard Men facing them were also divided into two forces, despite their comparatively thin numbers. The Hunters and the females were on the zombie side, while the males and warriors were on the skeleton side. Meanwhile, the priests remained within the village, defended by the walls. The Lizard Men had come out of the village because they knew that there was no point in laying up for a siege. There was no help coming for them, and the walls were anything but sturdy. In addition, the enemy was an army of the dead, who did not need rations or rest. Given these deeply unfavorable circumstances, a siege was a very bad idea. However, once the Lizard Men had formed up outside, they keenly understood the tremendous disparity between their forces and those of the enemy. A situation where 1 faced 3 could still be compared to that of 10 facing 30. But if 1,000 had to fight 3,000, the vast difference in their respective strengths became very apparent. Even if 3,000 undead beings did nothing but stand in ranks, they were still a very intimidating sight. Despite the circumstances, the Lizard Men did not show any signs of fear. Their ancestors were with them now, numbers counted for nothing to them. Soon, the undead forces began a slow advance. The zombies and skeletons began to move, while the skeleton archers and skeleton riders remained where they stood. Perhaps they were being held in reserve. The Lizard Men advanced as well. Oh! The wetlands echoed with an ear-piercing shout, accompanied by the sound of countless splashes. Water was churned into foam and dirt flew everywhere. The two armies continued advancing, until they were on the verge of a ferocious clash. However, an abnormality arose in the Nazarick army. The zombies and the skeletons had begun their advance together, but as they moved forward, they gradually drew apart. This was because the zombies were slow while the skeletons were swift. In addition, the wetlands were very difficult terrain. When slow monsters like zombies were mired down in mud, their movements became even slower. However, agile monsters like skeletons were not as badly affected. Therefore, the first engagement was between the skeletons and the Lizard Men warriors. The Lizard Men employed no formations, simply crashing into the skeletons. There was no art in their technique. They simply swung whenever they saw an enemy. Leading the way were the 5-head warriors of the various tribes. To some extent, it was foolish for a commander to lead from the front. However, they were the highest-ranked warriors of their respective tribes, and morale would suffer if they did not fight at the head of their troops. Instead, the Lizard Men were all in high spirits. They were backed by 89 armored warriors from the Razor-Tailed tribe. They wore hide armor and carried hide shields, and they possessed the highest defensive strength of any group among the tribes. They raised their shields, charging the skeleton horde as a single, united wall. Then, they clashed, the vanguards of the skeletons and the Lizard Men colliding with each other. In that moment, countless bones flew in all directions, and the Lizardman squadron tore into the skeleton horde. The sounds of carnage shook the heavens, and the sounds of bone crunching seemed endless. There were occasional cries of pain, but those were drowned out by the sounds of shattering bone. The Lizard Men had an incontestable advantage in this first engagement, and the tide of battle favored them. If the combatants were not Lizard Men, but humans, the opposite would probably be the case. Skeletons were made of bones, so piercing weapons were almost completely ineffective against him while they resisted slashing weapons to a certain extent. Therefore, human troops who used blades and swords as their primary weapons would have a hard time damaging those skeletons. The advantage of the lizard men stemmed from the fact that they used crude maces and clubs as their primary weapons, which inflicted bludgeoning damage, the bane of skeletons. The lizard men easily crushed the bony bodies of the skeletons with every swing of their weapons. Even if they survived one hit, the second would pulverize them. In contrast, the rusty longswords that the skeletons used were deflected by the tough scales and hides of the lizard men. While some of them were hurt, nobody sustained any fatal wounds. This was the first charge. Almost 500 skeletons lay in fragments from that clash alone. Cositus's jaw dropped as he stared at the vision within the mirror. This was only the first time they had stood toe-to-toe, but the strength of the lizard men had exceeded his expectations. As an excellent warrior himself, Cositus possessed a degree of insight into the strength of his enemy. It was true that as individuals, the skeletons were clearly weaker than the lizard men and they had no hope of victory. However, their numbers should have compensated for that weakness. Even so, this outcome had taken place. What was the meaning of this? It made him wonder if the lizard men had been strengthened by some other power. In all likelihood, only the skeleton archers and skeleton riders could claim victory over the lizard men as they were now. The skeletons crumbled one after the other as he watched the battle. The skeletons and zombies would probably only serve to sap their opponent's stamina. At this rate, the only effective troops we have are the 300 beast zombies, the 150 skeleton archers, and the 500 skeleton riders. The weight of numbers is now against us. Cositus calculated the odds in his mind. The undead were strong, especially in extended battles. Almost nobody could beat them at that. The undead did not feel anything, not fear, not pain, not fatigue, or the need for sleep. The advantages those characteristics bestowed in warfare hardly need to be stated. For instance, if one swung the mace at the head of a living creature, there was a high chance said creature would die, or if it survived, it would bleed profusely and suffer great pain. The person receiving the attack would naturally lose the will to fight. Of course, an exception had to be made for warriors who had been trained to endure great pain, but most people would not want to fight on. That was a perfectly natural reaction from living beings. But what about the undead? Crack their skulls. They would continue attacking while they leaked their brains with every blow. Break their arms. They would keep attacking with their shattered limbs. Chop off their legs. They would crawl to launch the next attack. Indeed, as long as the negative energy which served as their life force was not depleted, the undead would keep fighting. As long as the conditions for instant death were not met, decapitation was quite a common one for most low-tier undead beings. They would not lose the will to fight like humans would. In other words, the undead were perfect soldiers. It could not be denied that the lizard men were currently superior, going by individual strength. However, that state of affairs might not carry one. Cositus's opinion of the lizardmen went up by a notch, and he concluded that they were not a foe which could be instantly destroyed. That being the case, he had to draw out the battle. Should we pull back and wait for chance to launch another attack? Your servant feels that would be the wisest move. Your servant is of the opinion that it would be better to mobilize the archers and cavalry. No, we should continue the attack until the enemy is exhausted. But what good does it do to exhaust the foe? If we cannot smash their headquarters, the enemy will eventually recover their strength. Indeed, the enemy seems to have a strong defense, but they are hiding behind those fragile walls. What about taking the village and then encircling them? After listening to his servant's responses, Cositus picked up the message scroll and glanced at Entema, trying to read her expression. Entema looked disinterestedly at the mirror. She produced a green biscuit from somewhere and brought it to her chin, and soon, the sounds of crunching echoed through the room. That attitude seemed to be saying that she was unconcerned about the events that were unfolding. Perhaps that was why she had no expression on her face. No, that expressionless face was nothing more than a decoration. Cositus thought about her true nature, and realized that trying to read her expression was a foolish gesture. She was a familiar eater. Even Cositus's friend, Q-Huku of the Five Worsts in Nazarick, had bluntly stated that she is a most frightening person. Quote, that was her true nature. Cositus abandoned the plan of trying to divine her thoughts by reading her face and unfurled the scroll, sending the message to the army's commander. Are they looking down on us? Zenbero muttered. He did so quietly, but it was still loud enough that everyone watching the enemy from the wall could hear it. They aren't mobilizing their archers or cavalry. That makes me think that they're looking down on us. Yes, I thought they'd come at us all at once. Zombie fight, going well. There were only 45 hunters fighting the zombies. They launched hit-and-run attacks with thrown stones, slowly drawing the zombies away from the skeletons. The females slowly moved to a position where they could flank the skeletons. Don't you think their movements are very suspicious? Indeed. The zombies were not so much diverted as completely distracted by the hunters. Would any commander permit such movements? No, it should not have been possible, yet the zombies were moving as described. That being the case, what did the enemy have in mind? Nobody present had any idea. I don't quite understand what they're doing. I'm with Shasuryu. No matter how hard thought about it, they did not feel there was any particular significance to the zombies' movements. After observing for a while longer, Zayusu shared his thoughts with the others. Could it be that there's no commander? No commander. Do you mean to say that the undead have been acting on the orders they were given at the beginning of the battle? Yes. The lowest-tiered undead like zombies and skeletons did not possess intelligence. Therefore, giving them orders at the appropriate moment was the best way of commanding them. However, the zombies and other enemies seemed to have received orders to kill any nearby lizard men. That was what they were getting at. In other words, the enemy thought they could beat us by sheer weight of numbers. No, could it be that this battle is just to see how well they can fight without a commander? Seems that way. Bastards. Are they fucking with us? It was Shasuryu, not Zenbero, who was cursing. Even Shasuryu could not tolerate this sort of thing. After all, the lizard men were all betting their lives on this. Calm down, Shasuryu. We don't know if that's the case yet. Sorry. Though I guess it's good that we're doing well so far. Yeah, you are right, because we need to cut down the enemy's numbers as much as possible right now. Battle was a very fatiguing activity, and a pitched melee was unimaginably taxing on one's mental strength. On a battlefield where one did not know if the enemy would be coming from the front, rear, left, or right, merely swinging one's weapon a few times was several times more exhausting than normal. However, the undead did not feel fatigue, and they would continue attacking without respite. This was the difference between the living and the dead, and as time went by, that difference would become more and more apparent. In other words, time was the lizard men's enemy. It would be fine if only I could fight. Patience, Zenbero. Indeed, if a mighty warrior like Zenbero took the field, they could probably wipe out the skeletons in moments. However, that would mean revealing their ace in the hole. Zayusu's group of half a dozen people was their secret weapon. While they would obviously need to play their trump card in times of emergency, they could not reveal their true powers as long as the situation was not dire and if their greatest foe had not shown up yet. Still, if the enemy doesn't advance, doesn't that play right into our hands? Zhao Su told the others, who responded in the affirmative. Then, he turned to Crush and asked, "Are things still okay on your side?" "Yes, and the ritual's going well too." Crush answered Zhao Su's question as she looked around the village. The ritual which the priests were conducting in the village might well be another trump card for the lizard men. Normally, it would have taken a very long time, but since all the priests of all the tribes were gathered together, it was progressing at a tremendous pace, quickly enough to be used in this battle. So this is the power of cooperation. Yes. Granted, we did share some insights after that war in the past. Still, there's a lot of things I want to do after the war now. The other chiefs nodded vigorously at Xiaoyu's suggestion. They had shared a lot of knowledge thanks to this battle, and they had seen with their own eyes the importance of everyone working together towards a common goal. The three chiefs who had allied in the past but not exchanged information were particularly forceful in their agreement. Zhao Su looked at those 5 people, and smiled. "What's so funny? It's nothing. I just felt really happy despite our circumstances." Crush immediately picked up on what he was thinking. "Me too, Zhao Su." As he looked on the smiling Crush, Zhao Su's eyes narrowed as though she were wishing. They had looks of admiration and kindness in their eyes. It was only natural that they were not embracing. After all, they could not indulge their desires while lizard men were dying before them. However, Zhao Su's and Crush's tails seemed like independent creatures as they twitched, occasionally touching and separating. "Moo. Do you know what this situation is? As an older brother, we've been completely shut out. Or, they really do love each other. In short, good to be young, future is bright." The 4 older lizard men nodded as they looked on their adorable juniors. Of course, there was no way Crush and Zhao Su could not have heard that. Their tails moved and twitched without pause, but they had serious and proper expressions on their faces. The enemies making their move. Xiaoyu and the other chiefs could not help but smile bitterly at the sudden change in Zhao Su's attitude. At the same time, they cast their eyes toward the enemy formation. The skeleton riders were advancing en masse. Oi, don't tell me they're heading for us. The cavalry. Are they planning to shake our morale by striking directly at us? No, they should be planning to circle around the warriors and the males and then flank them, right? This was bad. Everyone came to the same conclusion without saying a word. The mobility of the skeleton riders was hard to deal with. If the skeleton riders had moved out at the beginning of the battle, they would have prioritized their destruction. However, the warriors and the male lizard men were currently locked in melee combat. The hunters were drawing off the zombies, and the females were flanking the skeletons with thrown rocks, so there was precious little manpower left to block the skeleton riders. "It looks like it'll be better if we make the first move." Xiaoyu nodded after the Small Fang tribe's chief spoke. "The question now is who we should send out. Or rather, who we should allow to fight first." Skeleton riders. They were lance-wielding skeletons mounted on skeletal horses. They had no special characteristics beyond their enhanced mobility, but said mobility was outstanding on this marshy terrain. Their bodies were made of bone and would not sink too deeply into the mud, which meant that they could advance at the speed of a regular horse. Nearly 100 skeleton riders were moving forward, intent on circling around behind the lizard men to destroy them from behind. They saw 3 lizard men approaching from their front and left, in other words, from the village, but the skeleton riders paid him no heed. They had not received orders to engage them, so they would ignore them as long as they did not attack. Unintelligent undead were such creatures. Just as they were about to reach the rear of the Lizardmen forces, the leading skeleton rider's world was suddenly flipped and turned upside down. The horsemen flew far into the air and crashed heavily to the marsh. A human would have been confused and been unable to act. However, the skeleton rider was an unintelligent undead being, and it immediately continued moving to fulfill its orders. Though it rose quickly, it had been injured, and so it moved with a bit of a limp. Just then, it was hit by another unhorsed skeleton rider, and the shattered bones of the two skeleton riders were scattered all over the marsh. Scenes like this were happening everywhere. Why had something like this happened on the wide-open wetlands? The answer was simple: it was a trap. There had been open wood and boxes buried in the marsh, and when the skeleton horses stepped into them, they had fallen. The skeleton riders fell one after the other. If they were humans, they would have slowed their pace. However, the skeleton riders would not do that. While they had enough judgment to avoid a hole they were aware of, they had no ability to be wary of traps. This was because they had no orders to do so, and no intelligence to allow them to adapt to the situation. Their headlong rush into the traps looked like a form of mass suicide. Still, while the traps were very effective, they were ultimately only a delaying measure. They could inflict some damage, but they could not eliminate the skeleton riders by themselves. The fallen skeleton riders rose to their feet, covered in mud. Just then, there was a whoosh and the sound of the air parting. Just like that, one of the fallen skeleton riders had its head knocked off. The skeleton riders judged this to be enemy action, and looked around. Just then, another skeleton rider's head flew off its shoulders, shattered like a glass marble. The skeleton riders spotted 3 lizard men about 80 meters away from them. They also saw them launching stones from the slings in their hands, crushing the skulls of the skeleton riders. The skeleton riders began moving. At the same time, the battle situation with the skeletons began to change. After the sound of countless bowstrings being pulled taut, the sound of arrows filled the air like the falling of rain. The 150 skeleton archers fired at the melee with the skeletons and the lizard men. They did not just discharge 1 arrow each, but 2, 3. The lizard men had not expected an arrow storm like that. Many lizard men were hit by arrows and collapsed. They could not fight the skeletons and block the arrow attacks at the same time. Of course, the skeletons were hit by the arrows as well, but they were not hurt. Using the skeletons, who were nigh immune to piercing damage as screens, and then having the skeleton archers fire from behind them was a near-perfect strategy. They would have enough time to wipe out all the lizard men in the time it would take to bash through the 2,000 skeletons screening them. The problem was that they had used that tactic too late. If they had opened with that move, the fate of the lizard men would have been sealed. They would have been drowned under the overwhelming tide of enemy forces and victory would have been decided. However, the outcome of the battle was largely decided by this point. The lizard men ignored the skeletons, and charged the skeleton archers in the rear. 150 arrows fell like rain, and several lizard men hit the ground as a result. Yet, that was only a small portion of their forces. The lizard men had thick skin and strong scales, so even without armor, they had the same defensive strength as humans in leather armor. Even if an arrow somehow pierced their hides, their thick layer of muscles kept them alive. In addition, the skeleton archers did not have much strength behind their draws. That was another reason why they could not kill the lizard men. The lizard men roared fearlessly as they charged. They crossed their arms over their heads as the arrow storm fell upon them, and even if they were impaled by the shafts, they continued regardless. 3 arrows. This was the most each of the skeleton archers managed to loose. If they had any intelligence, they would have fallen back. It would have been better if they retreated for the moment and then regrouped to engage the serving undead troops. However, the skeletons' minds could not process such complicated orders, and such orders had not been given anyway. Therefore, they could only do as they had been told: keep firing on the lizard men even if they get close. There was a mighty roar, and then the skeletons and skeleton archers alike drowned under the rising tide of lizard men. The skeleton archers could no longer show their stuff at this range. Their part was to be punching bags for their enemies, and so they fell steadily, in twos and threes. Currently, the zombies were still alive, but the skeletons had been almost completely beaten into the ground. This was when the enemy sent out new foes. Those were the beast zombies. These monsters, made from the corpses of wolves, snakes, pythons, and other such creatures, combined the strength of zombies and the agility of wild animals. The beast zombies ran at the lizard men. The swift ones surged ahead while the slow ones lagged behind. It was a ragged charge with no formation to speak of. Attacks from below were unexpectedly hard to avoid. The beast zombies would tear at their foes' legs and finish them off once they were immobilized. It was a truly savage combat technique. The increasingly fatigued lizard men had a hard time warding off these attacks. Several lizard men were too slow to avoid having their throats torn out by the beast zombies. After seeing their comrades fall, even the ones who had steeled themselves for combat or believed in ancestral protection could not hide the looks of fear on their faces. The head warriors had led their men into the bloody fray, but now they were gradually being forced back. Just as they thought the line of battle would eventually break, the ground before them swelled. Before them appeared two armless and legless lumps of mud, around 160 centimeters tall. The two clumps of mud began moving. They had no legs, but they moved adroitly and smoothly over the wetlands, towards the beast zombies. After closing the distance, the mud clumps sprouted whips that were longer than him from the places where a human's arms would have been. This was one of the trump cards of the lizard men, the swamp spirits summoned by the combined efforts of all the priests. The swamp spirits charged into the beast zombies and attacked with their tentacle-like whip arms, seizing the enemy. Naturally, the beast zombies fearlessly counterattacked, slashing with claws and tearing with fangs. This was a battle between beings that knew no fear. However, the tide turned in favor of the swamp spirits, purely because of the difference between their fighting strengths. The power of their priests had defeated the unliving. This fact rekindled the lizard men's courage, and they rallied for another charge. A brutal battle ensued. Unlike the previous fight with the skeletons, the lizard men began to take casualties. However, victory was at hand for the lizard men, who had the advantage of numbers. "We will lose." Cositus understood that much. There were no intelligent undead among the forces he had been assigned. That was the main cause of their defeat, and something which had worried him from the start, but he had not expected them to be that weak. Cositus's head ached at his naivete. While there was a way to turn the tables in a situation like this, he did not favor it much, because making that move was tantamount to admitting defeat. Still, how could he report failure to his master? Cositus picked up the message scroll. Who should he send this message to? Demiurge. Indeed it is, old friend. Why would you contact me? Has something happened? A calm, even voice spoke in Cositus's mind. Demiurge's intelligence was top class in Nazarick. Surely he would have an idea for a situation like this. On a certain level, Demiurge could also be considered a rival of his, so Cositus was not too happy about asking him for help. Still, the most important thing was to avoid defeat. How could the armies of the great underground tomb of Nazarick be beaten in battle? He was willing to cast aside his pride and bow before others for help in order to avoid that outcome. Actually, after hearing a scroll's worth of explanation about the current situation, Demiurge, who had been listening, quietly sighed in exasperation. Then, what do you want me to do? Hope you can help me think of something. If this carries on, we will be defeated. Can accept personal defeat, but cannot allow the great tomb of Nazarick, the supreme beings, to be disgraced in such way. Do you think Ains Sama truly wishes for victory? What do you mean? I am saying, why do you think Ains Sama picked out such low-tier fodder for an army? Cositus had harbored his doubts about that point. He had no idea what reason could warrant drafting the dregs of Nazarick into a fighting force. Ains Sama must have his own motives. But what could they be? There are several possibilities that come to mind. That's Demiurge for you. Cositus did not say that, though his respect for the demon grew in silence. Let me ask you something, Cositus. You've been there for several days now. Don't you think you should have gathered intelligence on the lizard men? He was right. However, no, Ains Sama ordered me to defeat the foe with that force, in a head-on confrontation. That is indeed the case, but I hope you will think carefully on it, Cositus. The important thing is what sort of results you will show Ains Sama. Am I wrong? If exterminating the village was the objective, then you should have considered the ideal methods for extermination, don't you think? Cositus had nothing to say, because Demiurge had hit the nail on the head. Ains Sama must have assigned you those servants because he had that in mind. You mean to say that Ains Sama deliberately assigned me inadequate troops? The possibility is very high. If you had researched the village beforehand, perhaps you would have known that your forces would be insufficient to conquer the village. In that event, you would have told Ains Sama that exterminating the village will be difficult with these forces. I wish to request reinforcements. That was most likely Ains Sama's objective. In other words, Demiurge was trying to say that Cositus had to divine his master's intent and adapt his methods to the situation, not follow orders blindly. This seems to be one of Ains Sama's plans to improve the way in which we approach matters, but he seems to have other objectives in mind as well. Other objectives? Cositus hurriedly asked Demiurge. He had already erred once, and he did not wish to further add to his mistakes. Ains Sama sent messengers to the village, but he did not state Nazarick's name at all. In addition, he ordered you not to take the field. That being the case, Cositus gulped as he waited for Demiurge to continue speaking. However, Demiurge did not. Cositus, forgive me, something urgent has cropped up. I apologize, but let's leave our conversation here. Good luck. Demiurge's words cut off and the message ended. As Cositus wondered what would panic a calm person like him, his gaze shifted to someone else seated at a table within the room. He saw Entama peeling a tattered talisman from her forehead and casting it down. If she, a talismancer, was using a talisman, that meant it was too late for anything else. That being the case, now was the time to deploy the final undead being, his trump card. However, would that really fulfill his master's aims? This might be the first time Cositus had contemplated his master's true underlying motives. However, there was only one conclusion he could reach. Cositus cast the message spell. Heed me, Elder Lich Commander. Attack and show the lizardmen your power." The bony body, dressed in a luxurious but time-worn set of robes, clutched a gnarled staff in one of its hand. Its skin was a thin layer stretched over the skull underneath, and it was beginning to rot, and it bore a malevolent intelligence within its eyes. Its body radiated negative energy like a mist which shrouded it. This undead magic caster was the Elder Lich in question. After receiving its orders, the undead creature looked over the marsh. Then, it turned to the blood meat hulks, undead creatures that were masses of red skin and muscle behind it. To these fellow creations of the same supreme being, he gave an order. "Kill those 3 lizard men." Upon receipt of those orders, the 2 blood meat hulks lumbered out towards the 3 lizard men who were devastating the skeleton riders. While the blood meat hulks were low-tier undead who could only attack with brute strength, they possessed the power of regeneration. As a result, it would take a long time to bring them down with physical attacks on their level. The Elder Lich felt that the blood meat hulks could buy him enough time. This could be considered a foolish strategy. The Elder Lich was a magic caster and not used to melee combat, so under normal circumstances, it would have been better to keep the blood meat hulks by his side. However, he could not do that now. His orders were to show the lizardmen your power. Therefore, he had to proceed alone and destroy the lizardmen headquarters with his overwhelming might. The Elder Lich advanced. Its face twisted into a fearsome shape as it chuckled. He felt that this was a piece of cake. He had been personally made by the supreme being Ainzu Orgone, and he was far superior to the automatically spawning Elder Liches in Nazarick. And now, his task was to demonstrate his puissance to the lizard men. He swore to achieve victory by the name his master had given him. "I, Igva, shall dedicate this triumph to my liege."